No alarm clock, no morning commute, no boss, no paycheck, no Monday, no email, no career ladder, no retirement plan, no word for job. For 300,000 years, this was just an ordinary morning, and by nearly every measure that matters, they were living better than you are right now. You wake when your body decides it's done sleeping. No schedule, no place to be, no one waiting on a report. You sit up, you stretch, and you ask the only real question of the day: what do I actually want to do with it? For almost the entire span of human existence, that wasn't a fantasy. It was every single morning. Now, most of us were taught the opposite story. We picture prehistoric life as a nonstop survival horror film. Wake up, try not to get eaten, grunt at something, die young. It's a vivid image. It's also almost completely wrong. And the reason we believed it is almost funny. We dug up the hard evidence of ancient life and jumped straight to conclusions. Bones with cut marks, stone weapons, the butchered remains of hunted animals. And we decided it must have been brutal survival every day. But we found other things too. We found cave paintings, we found flutes carved from bird bone, we found necklaces made from shells and teeth and carefully drilled stones. Those are not the belongings of a species trapped in constant panic. Those are the belongings of people who had time on their hands, a lot of it, and were doing genuinely interesting things with it. The first person to measure this properly was an anthropologist. In 1963, Richard Lee tracked the daily activities of the Hoansi people in Botswana, one of the last groups still living in a way that resembled pre-agricultural life. He wanted to know how much time they actually spent getting food. The famous answer was about 17 hours a week. But that number needs an honest asterisk because it counted only the hunting and gathering itself. Once you add in food processing, cooking, tool repair, hauling firewood, and the long walks to and from the foraging grounds, the real figure climbs to something much closer to a full modern work week. So the tidy story that they work 2 days while we work 5 is mostly a myth. Here's the part that survives the correction, though. When researchers step back and compare entire societies, foragers still come out with a bit more downtime, not less. One broad review found hunter-gatherers averaged around 6.5 hours of work a day, against nearly 9 for farming and industrial societies. It's a far smaller gap than the headline promised, but it's a real one, and it points the same direction. And that rough pattern turns up wherever anthropologists look: the Hadza in Tanzania, the Aka in Paraguay, the Martu in Australia, across totally different climates and continents. And it's worth sitting with how that compares to now. The average modern adult, once you subtract the job, the commute, and the endless admin of keeping a life running, gets maybe 2.5 to 3 hours of genuine leisure a day, if they're lucky. And most of that gets spent staring at a screen engineered to keep them anxious enough to keep scrolling. And to be clear, none of this means their lives were soft. Many children died young. Medicine barely existed. Violence between groups was a real and present danger. And a bad injury or a bad season could kill you. It wasn't paradise, and it wasn't gentle. But in the specific matter of how a day was shaped, how much of your own life actually belonged to you, they had something most of us have quietly lost. An anthropologist named Marshall Salins gave this a name that scandalized his field at the time. He called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society, not because they owned a lot, they owned almost nothing, and on purpose, because everything you own is one more thing you have to carry. They were affluent because they had the one thing modern people chase their whole lives and rarely catch: time. Abundant, unscheduled, genuinely free time. Now, you might be thinking, sure, but those are modern people. How do we know ancient humans lived the same way? Fair question. And the answer is written into their skeletons. When you line up the bones of ancient foragers against the early farmers who came after them, the difference is stark. The farmers were shorter. Their teeth were riddled with cavities from grain-heavy diets. Their spines showed arthritis from repetitive labor. And they died younger. The foragers before them? Taller, stronger, healthier teeth, less joint damage. The bones tell one clear story. The people doing less grinding physical labor were the ones who came first. And then there's the evidence that shouldn't exist at all if life was one long emergency: art. In 1994, explorers crawled into Cova Cave in southern France and found paintings made around 30,000 years ago. Horses, lions, rhinoceroses, rendered with perspective, with shading, with a real sense of movement. This was not a desperate scribble. This was skilled work that took planning, practice, and hours of time deep in the dark by firelight for no reason except that someone had something to say. And it keeps going. In Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found perforated shell beads 100,000 years old. The nearest coastline was 20 kilometers away, meaning someone walked a 40-kilometer round trip just to collect shells, then sat and drilled tiny holes through each one with stone tools, purely to make something to wear. In Germany, researchers found a 40,000-year-old flute carved from a vulture's bone, 5 finger holes perfectly spaced. Whoever made that understood pitch. They understood music, and they spent real time building an instrument to play it. And none of this was crude. We call it the Stone Age as if it means simple, but the skill involved was enormous. Shaping a blade from flint means understanding exactly how the stone fractures and controlling every strike, because one wrong blow shatters the whole piece. People who try to learn it today say real proficiency takes years. Making clothing meant scraping hides clean, treating them, then stitching them with needles carved from bone. Needles with tiny eyes someone drilled by hand, because the quality of the work mattered to them, because they cared. But the detail that hits the hardest isn't the art, it's the care. We have found skeletons of people who lived for years, sometimes decades, with disabilities that would have made it impossible to hunt or gather at all. A Neanderthal man from Shanidar cave in Iraq had a withered arm, partial blindness, hearing loss, and old healed leg injuries. He lived to around 40, genuinely old for the time. He could not have fed himself. His group fed him anyway, not because they had to, but because they chose to. In a cave in Spain, researchers found the remains of a young child, possibly with Down syndrome, though the surviving fragments are partial enough that experts still argue over the diagnosis, who lived to around 6 years old, well over 100,000 years ago. Whatever the exact condition, keeping a child like that alive in that world would have taken years of care that no cold survival math can explain. Someone simply wanted them to live. So let's actually reconstruct a normal day. You wake around dawn. Last night's fire is still smoldering and someone leans over to feed it. Breakfast is whatever's left over. Meat from yesterday's hunt, some nuts, a handful of berries gathered the day before. And breakfast is social. People talk. They plan the day loosely, not because a schedule demands it, but because that is simply what humans do. Mid-morning, a small group might head out to hunt or gather. But here's the key thing. You don't go every day. If the last hunt went well and there's food stored, you might not leave camp at all. You'd spend the morning working on tools instead, sharpening a spear, weaving a basket, scraping a hide soft enough to wear. There's no clock and no supervisor over any of it. You do it because being skilled earns you respect, and because making things well is part of being a person. When hunting does happen, it looks nothing like the movies. Humans are persistence hunters. We don't outrun our prey in a sprint because we can't. Instead, we track an animal at a steady jog through the hottest part of the day, and every time it stops to cool down, we reappear on the horizon and it bolts again, until it finally overheats and collapses from exhaustion. We can do this because we sweat, while most animals cool themselves only by panting, which forces them to stop moving. We just outlast them. A hunt like that might take 3 to 6 hours. Then the animal is carried back, butchered, and shared out. Everyone eats, and by early afternoon, the productive part of the day is basically finished. What comes next is the part modern people find hardest to picture, because it's both nothing and everything. People rest. They sit in the shade and talk. They play with the children. They groom each other, picking through hair, quietly reinforcing bonds. They make jewelry. They carve. They nap. The anthropologist James Sussman, who spent more than 25 years living with the hoansi, described how much of the day simply flowed into this: being with other people, not working, not sleeping, just talking, laughing, telling jokes. And that isn't idle time being wasted. In a world with no money, no police, and no written contracts, your survival depends entirely on your relationships. If people like you, they share when you're hungry. So you pour enormous time into those bonds, because those bonds are what keep you alive. The children weren't off in a classroom. They learned by playing, copying the adults, inventing games, wrestling, racing, testing each other. Play was how they learned to hunt, to negotiate, to lose, and try again. The line between playing and learning basically didn't exist. Then the sun goes down, and something remarkable happens. In 2014, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner recorded conversations among the Jew hoansi. During the day, the talk was practical. Who saw tracks where, plants were ready, who wasn't sharing fairly. But at night, around the fire, roughly 8 out of every 10 conversations turned into something else entirely. Stories, myths about how the world began, tales of ancestors who did impossible things, jokes that made everyone laugh. Wiesner was careful to call her study exploratory. We can't read the deep past straight off modern people. But she argued the pattern pointed to something profound. That this fireside space with a full stomach and nothing to do but talk is likely where human culture itself was born. And here's where the popular story gets something backwards. You've probably heard that ancient humans slept in 2 chunks, waking for an hour in the middle of the night to talk or pray before dropping off again. That pattern is real, but it comes from the diaries of pre-electric Europe, not from foragers. When scientists actually strapped sleep trackers onto present-day hunter-gatherers, the Hadza, the San, the Chimene, in a study published in 2015, they found something stranger. These groups slept less than we assume, only around 6 or 7 hours a night, and they did it in one solid stretch. No 2 phases, and almost no insomnia. Some of their languages didn't even have a proper word for it. They didn't sleep more than us. They just slept better. And they were good at something we've almost entirely lost. Real rest. Not sleep, but sitting by a fire after dark, letting thoughts drift with no agenda at all. We fill every spare second now with a podcast, a scroll, a notification. They filled it with nothing, on purpose. And that stillness is very likely where the first questions and the first stories ever came from. So here's what a full day actually looked like. A few hours getting food or making tools. A long stretch of talking, grooming, playing, and storytelling. Around 6 or 7 hours of deep sleep in a single unbroken block. Almost untouched by the kind of lie-awake nights we treat as normal. And the rest of it, just resting, sitting, watching the fire, existing, without ever once having to justify that existence by being productive. If you're finding this as strange and a little haunting as I did, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps more of these get made. And there's a lot more of this story to tell, because the story doesn't just stop here. This is where it takes its darkest turn. And then, about 10,000 years ago, it ended. Humans in the Fertile Crescent started planting seeds and keeping animals, farming. And farming, it turns out, is a trap. Once you can grow food, you can feed more people. More people means you need more food, which means more farming, which means still more people. Within a few generations, the population had exploded, and there was no going back. There were now far too many mouths to feed by hunting and gathering alone. You were locked in. And the work multiplied. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing, guarding the crop. The skeletons make the verdict unambiguous. The first farmers worked harder, ate worse, and died younger than the foragers who came right before them. But the population kept climbing, and bigger populations needed specialists. Potters, weavers, tool makers, then soldiers, priests, and administrators. And eventually came the idea we now take completely for granted, that your time could belong to someone else in exchange for the resources you needed to survive. That is a job. By the time we built the first cities, the original human life was gone, replaced by schedules, obligations, and the need to spend most of your waking hours just staying afloat in a system we built ourselves. Today, you'll spend around 90,000 hours of your life working. Your ancestors spent a fraction of that. You lie awake at 2 in the morning and call it insomnia, a word some of their languages didn't even have. You chase success by standards someone else invented, hoping one day you'll finally earn some rest. They woke up most mornings already rested, already free, with nothing to prove to anyone. They weren't a different species. They were us. They just lived the exact life we are now working our entire lives trying to retire into. No alarm clock, no boss, no 90,000 hours. Just a fire, a full stomach, a story in the dark, and a whole day that belonged completely to you. We didn't lose that life to fate. We traded it away, and most of us never even knew it was ours to begin with.